and thank you for joining us today for another Tuesday afternoon program here with the Genealogy Center. We are looking forward to today's program, which is the subject of our speaker's new book, In Search of the Blonde Tigress, which will talk about researching missing persons. And our speaker is Silvia Pettem, and she is a Colorado-based historical researcher, writer, and author. And after local history research led her to the identification of a decades-old murder victim, she switched from writing about history to the genre of true crime. And her latest book, which is the subject of this presentation, In Search of the Blonde Tigress, the Untold Story of Eleanor Jarman, combines biography and prison reform in the 1930s with modern-day evidence that has helped to unravel a long-standing mystery. So with that, I will hand it over to Silvia, and we'll go ahead and get started.
I really appreciate being invited. I'm looking forward to sharing this story with all of you. And I have to admit right up front that I'm used to talking to an audience, so I can't see any of you. I don't know how many are here, and I don't know anything about you, so bear with me. But I'm a little rusty when it comes to just doing Zoom meetings. So with that said, we'll just get started, and there'll be time for Q&A afterwards, but I don't mind a question as we go along too. So just put your questions up for Kate, and we'll get going here. First of all, I need to explain that Eleanor Jarman was a young woman who got involved with crime in Chicago, was sent to prison and escaped in 1940. And how I got caught up in her story is kind of just sort of a serendipitous event. I've always been working on missing persons and unidentified remains. I've done quite a bit of research and work for various police agencies and written some other books. And I love going back in time as well. And so I was Googling one day on the internet, and I found a list of fugitives, and Eleanor Jarman was listed, and I'm sure she still is, as the longest running female fugitive in this country. As I mentioned, she escaped in 1940, and she never was found. And I'm sure it was naivety, but I decided that would be kind of an ultimate challenge to see if I could try to figure out what happened to this lady. And the first question I always get is, why isn't she blonde? And you'll see in the photos, they're black and white photos, but her hair looks very dark. And that's because when she was hiding from police, she dyed her hair red, and it shows up much darker. So she's always been called the Blonde Tigress. That was just a name given by newspaper writers to sensationalize her story and sell more newspapers. But she was not blonde at the time. Eleanor was born in Sioux City, Iowa, and this story that I set out to, it didn't even necessarily need to become a book. It was just research at first, but when I started researching her, it was more along the line of a biography, and then it really turned into a detective story. She was born in 1901. Her whole family, she came from a large family. Many of them were involved with meatpacking plants in Sioux City. She married a young man, Michael Jarman, who worked at the stockyards, and they got married, had 2 children. She worked as a waitress both in Sioux City and after when they moved to Chicago. So they were a young family in Chicago in the early 1920s. And then Michael was an alcoholic. He abandoned the family, and she was pretty much on her own. She was just a young woman in Depression era Chicago, struggling to support 2 young children. So I tried to figure out everything that I could about her. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here because many of you are genealogists, but I started a private family tree for Ella. That was her birth name, Eleanor Marie Berendt. The name Eleanor came later, but I built this private research tree just initially for myself. I started compiling as much data as I could find and sifted through it and supplemented it with newspaper articles. And then, as you all know, there's all kinds of conflicts and questions, and but you have to start somewhere. So I started with this tree, and then the meat of my research was in primary source documentation, which I'll get into here, because I'm really gearing this presentation toward those of you who do this kind of research. And I know the subtitle says missing persons, but we're essentially looking for Eleanor, one missing person, and another man who comes into her story about halfway through. But I had to learn about the historical context, and this was pretty easy for me because my husband and I are big fans of film noir movies, so we're always watching some old movie, but I just immersed myself in the gangster era, Prohibition, Great Depression, tried to learn everything that I could about what life was like we're getting now into early 1930s in Chicago. Eleanor and her boyfriend, which you'll hear more about in a minute, George, they were essentially contemporaries of Bonnie and Clyde. And I think this is a great photo of Bonnie Parker. But the other photo is a bar in Chicago right after the end of Prohibition. So not only do you need to read about this era, but you just have to immerse yourself in it and study the photos. And just that's what I try to do, is just learn everything that I could. So here I am in my home office in Chicago, and I want to mention I had two fellow researchers, Mary in Ohio and Mickey in Virginia. These were women that I met Mickey actually a long time ago. I think it was back in 2003 when I was working on another case. It was the Boulder Jane Doe project. And Mickey and I have been corresponding ever since. We only met in person once, and that was back in 2006, but I don't think a week goes by that we don't email each other. And I met Mary a couple years ago with another book project. We both became interested in a woman named Dorothy Arnold, who went missing from New York City in 1910. So we corresponded a lot about that. But when I mentioned this project to both of these ladies, they both wanted to help, and their help was invaluable. We all searched in different ways with different databases and compared notes, and I have to credit the outcome of our research to having these two wonderful women to help me. One of the first things we did, though, was to look for men in Eleanor's life. Her first husband, this is from a witness statement, Eleanor called her a worthless lout. Then there was a former boyfriend, and he popped up in a newspaper article, but he was unnamed, so it took a while for us to figure out who he was. And then came George, and that's the man here on the right, George Dale, and he was her partner in crime. He was her boyfriend in 1933, and before the crime that got these people arrested, they were involved in what were called daylight robberies. There was a whole series of 35 to 40 small robberies that they all committed in the daytime with another man. So there were three people involved, and they went around to small shops in downtown Chicago, just little clothing stores and that sort of thing. And if there were other customers in the store, they just acted like they were shopping. But if they were the only customers in the store, they would hold up the shopkeeper or steal some merchandise. What got them arrested and got them into trouble was George shot an elderly shopkeeper. His name was Gustav Poe, and that was in the beginning of April in 1933. Eleanor, in my opinion, after reading court testimony and everything, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's no way of knowing exactly what part she played, but I think, again, you have to realize this was the Depression, and she was out of work at the time. I think George put food on the table, took care of her children. Clothing, food, gave them a place to live. I think she kind of just went along with it, but there's no way to prove that. This is a picture that was in the newspaper shortly after Eleanor and her boyfriend George and the other man Leo were arrested. But already the newspaper's calling her the Blonde Tigress. And again, this was to sell newspapers, but the two men that she was with didn't receive anywhere near as much publicity. The reporters just kind of played up the fact that she was the gang leader, and she was the notorious one that really did receive. The district attorney and everybody else wanted her to get the death penalty, but that was everything was focused on her and not the two other men. The woman on the right here is the widow of the man that was killed, and she testified in court as well. So to begin my primary source research, I started with the Chicago Police Department, and this was actually a whole lot easier than I thought it would be. I filed a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request with the Chicago Police Department, and they sent me I don't know, a dozen or more of these documents digitally. They were really quite interesting to read because they talked about, who arrived, what police officer arrived on the scene, various witness statements, just all kinds of details about the crime, getaway car and all that sort of thing. But I found them conflicting in the statements. One person heard 2 gunshots, another heard 4 gunshots. You can't, they weren't really any more valuable than the newspaper articles for what happened, but they certainly were a good starting point. Photographs were just absolutely invaluable. I can't imagine doing any kind of historical research without getting the original high quality photographs. Now, if you just do a newspaper search for Eleanor Jarman, you'll find dozens and dozens of photographs, including the ones that I'm using here. But you can't write a book with a newspaper photograph. You have to use the original one, and they have to be good quality. But getting those was a real problem. Many of these came from the Chicago Tribune, and first they told me they weren't available, and then they said they were off-site and they weren't digitized. And finally, 7 months later, they agreed to send somebody from their office over to find these photographs and digitize them. So they were available, and this one I particularly like, but you could see that she is not a blonde. It's one thing to read in newspaper accounts that this is Captain Malone of the Austin. That's a part of Chicago. The Austin Police Department was interrogating Eleanor about the guns that were found in their apartment. It's one thing to read about in the newspaper, but it's entirely different just looking at it here in this photo. You can see how upset she was and how much of a police presence he was. He's just so much bigger and more confident here in this picture. But again, bringing in photographs, this is a photograph of the Cook County Jail. It had only been open for a few years, and it was one of the largest jails in the world at the time. But I think it's really interesting, this photo of Eleanor here. Some photographer obviously had her posed in a very fancy dress and high heels, white high heels in a jail cell. That's certainly not prison garb. So more primary source documents. I started digging into county court records, and these were from the Circuit Court of Cook County in Chicago. And I had contacted this county clerk and said that I wanted to look at some of these documents, but they said they were off-site storage, just like the photo. So I had to wait and have them get out of off-site storage. And then when they finally were there, I said I would like to come in and look at them. Problem is that I'm in Colorado, and this was during COVID, and plane fares were expensive, and I wasn't sure I really wanted to go to Chicago. And by the end of the summer, the clerk called me and he said, we're going to have to put these back in off-site storage. And I said, that's really unfortunate, because I'd like to see these. And he said, well, I can recommend a private researcher. And I just want to put the word out that hiring a private researcher in a city you're not familiar with, that you can't afford to go to, is just wonderful. If anybody wants to contact me privately, I can give you this man's name. But he researched hundreds and hundreds of pages for me. I think he took his own scanner and spent the day and got all kinds of documents. Now, this was not testimony, but it was all kinds of background documents, legal stuff, and it turned out to be very helpful. The true bill here was deciding if there was probable cause to go on to a trial, and all about charges and arraignment and jury duties. And there was even some information about a sanity hearing for the third member of the trio, not Eleanor or George, but the other man. So in these court records, I spent probably months going over them, because there was just so much that I couldn't absorb it all at once. And every time I did, I found something new. And this was an affidavit about a change of venue. And that was obviously a concern for Eleanor and her attorney, because she was getting all this negative publicity in the newspaper. And it was signed by a man named Richard Slater. And when I first saw this, I had absolutely no idea who Richard Slater was, but he would become very important in Eleanor's story. I also, through the Illinois State Archives, found these court transcripts. This is from the Supreme Court of Illinois, but they were the exact same transcripts as the original trial, which was in the end of September and was absolutely rushed through. Chicago at the time was having a crime wave, and I gather that they often do. I don't live in Chicago, but it seems like they often do. But anyway, the trial was all over within a week. They just ran them through. The prosecutor said he wanted to send as many people to the electric chair as possible. He recommended the death penalty for not only for the man that pulled the trigger, but for Eleanor and the other man as well. But the testimony is what I found really particularly interesting in this Supreme Court transcripts, because I got to hear for the first time Eleanor speaking in her own voice. And she had a couple jobs. Most of the time, as I mentioned before, she was a waitress, but one job, she was answering telephones for somebody, and apparently he had a window display to business or something, but that wasn't really clear. But she said, the name of the gentleman for whom I answer telephones is Slater. He is more or less a pretty good friend of mine. That is the same man, Richard Slater, that I found in that affidavit. So my ears started perking up. I wondered, okay, who is Slater? And if he was a good friend, how did he fit into Eleanor's story? So here I am searching not only for Eleanor, but also for Richard Slater. So in addition to the court transcripts and the affidavit, I found in the 1930 census that he lived essentially around the corner from Eleanor. This was in the west side of Chicago. And on Ancestry.com, I got in touch with his step-granddaughter. And I started a private tree for Richard Slater as well, and ended up doing his whole extended family. But this is the same man. It took a while for my fellow researchers and I to figure it out, who said that he, in the newspaper article where he was unnamed, it said a man who had lived with Eleanor for 2 years before George met her and lived with her. So Richard Slater, it becomes more and more obvious that he was the, quote, former boyfriend. And it did say in that same newspaper article that this man drove Eleanor's boys to her sister's house in Sioux City, Iowa. Obviously, Eleanor was not going to send her children off with a man that they didn't know or trust. So again, he was a close friend. Now, this is a photo during the trial. And again, it was over and done with in less than a week. The man on the left is the attorney for Eleanor, and there's Eleanor next to him. The man in the middle is Leo Menici, who was the third man in this trio who did these daylight robberies. And George is Eleanor's boyfriend there on the right, and he's the man who actually pulled the trigger. So the newspapers, again, played it up here. The day the trial was over, the big headline on the front page of the Tribune was, "Give Tiger Girl 199 years." So Tiger Girl and Blonde Tigress, it was just something that the newspaper people made up. They had one cartoon at one time saying that criminals should all be named for animals, and they had a hyena, and they had I don't know, giraffe or something. They had all kinds of different animals and saying this criminal was this one. But the Tiger Girl or the Blonde Tigress, they were both used for Eleanor. That just stuck with her. And as you can see, they didn't even mention the two men. It was just, everything was focused on Eleanor. So the news stories are absolutely essential to create a timeline. But you have to remember, anytime you're reading news articles, particularly about crime, they're sensationalized, people are misquoted, conclusions are incorrect. And again, they're not a primary source, but they do help, and they are necessary as one of the different resources. Now, this is a photograph, again, a newspaper photograph. It's Eleanor's there in the middle looking down with probably a jail matron, and she's escorting Eleanor to the train to leave Chicago to go to the prison, which was actually called a reformatory. It was in the town of Dwight, about 100 miles southwest of Chicago. But what struck me is this man on the left. The granddaughter of Richard Slater had sent me a photograph of him, and he is there, inserted there on the top. And that photograph was a few years later. But I mean, as soon as I saw this photograph, I am absolutely sure, there's no way to prove it, but I'm absolutely sure that this is the same man, that is Richard Slater standing there by the train to see her off. I mean, the hat, the glasses, the mustache. He's a little longer in the face in the insert photo, but that was 7 years later, and it's a different angle. But anyway, this was one of those serendipitous things that you get the photo and it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that before, but I just found that amazing. And then I started looking at movies about prisons. This is just called Women's Prison, and it was a movie from the early 1950s. So it was obviously later than Eleanor when she went in 1933, but and it's Hollywood's version, but it gives an insight into the era and the times and what probably went on in some prisons. And again, I just used it for background research, but I found that quite interesting. But when Eleanor arrived in prison, this is what the administration building looked like. And again, this was called a reformatory, not a prison. It was very progressive for its time. It was the only place for women to be incarcerated. Previously, they were in Joliet, but when this opened in 1930, women were transferred here. And then when Eleanor arrived, it was 1933. It looked more like a country estate than some prison. It didn't even have prison walls around it. It had a 12-foot barbed wire fence. And according to some newspaper articles, it said that the fence was more to keep people out than it was to keep the prisoners from escaping. They were pretty much on the honor system, but they were monitored every minute of every day. So I don't think that the administrators were too concerned about escapes, but apparently they happened. And when they happened, the escapees usually were caught and brought right back again. Now, Eleanor was, the inmates were all assigned different jobs, and Eleanor was in the laundry. And I don't believe she's in this photo, although she looks a little bit like the woman in the right on the back. But they're obviously enjoying their work. Eleanor, for the whole 7 years she was there, she did work in the laundry, and she was considered a model prisoner. She did everything right. She never broke any rules. She was rewarded for being a model prisoner by being allowed to wear white stockings. And you can see that woman in the back there has on white stockings. So she got more privileges than other women because of her. I think they classified her in the A status, but that meant she could wear those white stockings. Other inmates worked in the fields, and some worked as domestics. And I mean, they did essentially every kind of work that was needed on this, for this reformatory. And that's the superintendent there with the domestic workers. She was very good at her job. She stayed very long. Everything I read about her was very complimentary. I think she was rather prim and proper, and obviously very well dressed. George did get the electric chair. This was about 7 months after Eleanor was sent to prison. Leo was also sent to prison. They were both sent for 199 years, but he did go to Joliet. George Dale stayed behind in the Cook County Jail, and this is the electric chair there. The night before he was executed, he, according to a newspaper article, he wrote a letter to Eleanor and asked to be remembered, and asked for her to remember him to her children. So I think he certainly cared about her, but he was the only one of the three to be sent to be executed. Now, 2 years after Eleanor was admitted, so this is now 1935, Eleanor applied for commutation or parole. She did not receive it, but she made the application. And by this time I was getting documentation, prison documentation from the Illinois State Archives. And I was surprised when I opened this file up. There were letters of support from Richard Slater's family. Nothing from Richard Slater, but there's a reason for that. He kept a very low profile, and I'll get into that in a bit. But his sisters and their various extended family members wrote letters of support. This one from one sister said, "My husband, family, and I have known her, Eleanor, approximately 5 or 6 years. To our knowledge, she was always a good mother to her children and always worked. She met the wrong kind of people." So this again proves that this was a Richard Slater who did know Eleanor previous to the time that she met George Dale, got involved in crime, and was sent to prison. So that kind of solidified for me that Richard Slater really was her former boyfriend. And then I found this World War II document for Richard Slater, where he signed it. This was for, again, for World War II. But I compared the signature on that document with the change of venue signature that I had found before. And you can see that it's the very same signature, even though it was years apart. So again, now we know that this was the same man. The Mrs. Goldschmidt was his sister who wrote that letter of support that I just read in the previous slide. So all the pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and Richard Slater was just as interesting, well, almost as interesting as Eleanor, and to the fellow researchers and I, and along with the step granddaughter, we all together tried to work on him. And you can see on the top of this World War II document, it says alias Nathan Hertzfeld. So that opened up a whole lot of more inquiry. He had been born under one name, and then he lived after he'd met Eleanor under another name. We're still trying to figure out some of the reasons for that, but he had been born into a Jewish immigrant family. He was born in 1901, same age as Eleanor. He may have been hiding his Jewish heritage, or he may have been a conscientious objector in World War I. There's all kinds of reasons that he may have changed his name, but he also had some connections with the underworld. So we're still working on Richard Slater, but he is the man that I believe was very, very helpful to Eleanor all through this ordeal. In 1940 is when Eleanor and this woman, Margaret, who was a fellow inmate, made their escape from the Dwight Reformatory. Margaret was a much more hardened criminal than Eleanor. She had been in various prisons she worked as a housekeeper for people, and then she stole their jewelry and money while she was cleaning their houses. But she was in and out of various prisons. She had escaped from 2 other prisons. And I think that she probably just picked Eleanor because of Eleanor's notoriety, thinking that maybe the police would look more for Eleanor than her if they escaped together. But what they did is they were cleaning the staff quarters one morning and stole a polka dotted dress and a blue suit. And this was 11 o'clock in the morning in broad daylight. They took this stolen clothing and they essentially just climbed over the barbed wire fence, changed into clothes on the other side of the fence, and hitchhiked away wearing the staff clothing towards Chicago. And they managed to get away before anyone even knew they were missing. There was a head count an hour later at lunchtime, but once they were discovered missing, there were roadblocks and airplanes and all kinds of people searching for them, but they just disappeared into Chicago. And that's essentially the easiest part of this story, is how they escaped. They just climbed over the fence. But then the big question for me was, well, who helped Eleanor after her escape? And this was yet another agency called the Prisoner Review Board. Took a while through a FOIA request to get their documents, but buried in their documents, and this was after she had escaped, there was mention of Dick Slater, Richard Slater, obviously, who was a very close friend. There was no mention of any other friends, and the only family member who had ever corresponded with her in prison was her sister Hattie, who was taking care of her children. She had no visitors. Eleanor had no visitors in prison. She was there for 7 years. And for suddenly all this document to say that Dick Slater was a very close friend makes me really believe that he had followed her through the first boyfriend, George, through her prison years, and was ready to help her after she escaped. Now, Eleanor was on innumerable wanted posters. This is one from the reformatory. You can see it had a reward for $50, and then it was changed to $250, which was quite a bit more money, $5,300 today. She was also on FBI wanted posters. This was before they did most wanted posters, so they were just called wanted posters. But they were out everywhere. But these pictures were taken when she first went in 7 years earlier. Again, she probably changed her hairstyle, maybe put on some glasses. Who knows? I mean, it was very easy for an ordinary looking woman, which I think that she was, somewhat attractive, but I think she could have just disappeared very easily into a crowd. Now, Richard Slater had a wife, and this always surprises people, but he had a wife and a stepdaughter at the time. But he was according to the family, he was known to have strayed a bit. So I don't think that slowed him down in wanting to help Eleanor. But this is just a silly picture of Richard and his wife on some rural property that they own just north of Chicago. It's dated December 1939, but it proves that he owned property outside of the city. And I've looked up this property records, and it's rather obscure little place, and it's in the adjoining county north of Chicago. I think it was probably an ideal place if somehow they reconnected and he took her to this property. I can't prove that, but it's my theory that he took her to this retreat, maybe allowed her to live there for several months while she tried out different disguises and got up the courage to maybe apply for a job. And I think she ended up just blending into society as a waitress, just like she had before, without anybody knowing who she was. Here's another couple pictures. This one on the right is the one I showed you before in that inset, and that's Richard there with his new car in 1941. But he actually was the accountant he worked for the accountant for Al Capone. So he had some real underworld gangster related connections. Plus he was a taxi driver at the time. So he could have been anywhere doing anything, anywhere around or in Chicago. And he certainly had the help of his fellow underworld figures, to put it mildly. The pop culture, though, would not let Eleanor alone. This was an article here on the right, part of an article anyway, about calling her the most dangerous woman alive and still calling her the Blonde Tigress, and she's still beating people over the head. I'm not at all convinced that she did. There was absolutely nothing in the testimony about her hitting anybody over the head. Newspaper articles said that she kicked the dying man while he was bleeding on the sidewalk. None of the witnesses ever said that. It was all made up for sensationalism and to sell newspapers. On the left, there was that's about a TV episode called Gangbusters that really strayed from the truth. But it's all about Eleanor Jarman, and you can find it online if you Google Gangbusters and Eleanor Jarman. If you can't find it, again, contact me, and my information will be on the handout you'll get at the end. But it's interesting as a piece of pop culture, but it's not at all anywhere near the truth. So I think that Eleanor got a Social Security card under a fake name. I could go into all kinds. I don't have time right now, but that was very easy to do in the 40s and 50s. And in 1993, Eleanor's grandson contacted the press, and he was trying to get Eleanor to come out of hiding. And he claimed that they had been in contact and that she had used either the name Marie Millman or the name Marie Melman as an alias. So again, I got back on Ancestry and Family Search and newspaper sites, and I looked for every Marie Millman or Marie Melman of similar age. Obviously, you wouldn't put your name into Social Security with your exact birth date, because then they would be able to find you. But I looked for someone of in the similar era, and I looked for anyone who had parents or spouse or siblings, and I eliminated them. Because obviously, if you're going under the name of an alias, you're not going to have somebody in an obituary or somebody's wedding, or it had to be someone who had no ties. And there was only one person left, and it was a woman named Marie H. Millman. And I did get some basic information from Social Security, but nothing more detailed. But I did, like I did before, I set up a family tree. I'm really a big believer in setting up family trees on Ancestry. This is private. if any of you would like to research further on this woman, I welcome that, and I will, if you contact me privately, I will share that tree with you. Excuse me, I'm starting to lose my voice here. But she claimed she was born on May 4th, 1908. Now, Eleanor was born in 1901, but that was close enough for me for the era. And this is a spoiler alert. I'm sorry. I know the book just came out and most of you haven't had a chance to read it, but I did find that this woman died in Denver, Colorado in 1980. So in my private tree, I had a birth date, and there was what was called an FBI complaint. It said that she had fled the state of Illinois in 1901. That came out in a, quote, complaint in 1952. But everything else that I was able to put into the family tree that I got from Ancestry was just about where she lived and where she worked. And she lived and worked in and around Colfax Avenue in Denver, Colorado, from 1951 until 1980 when she died. So again, I apologize if you didn't want a spoiler alert, but I found that she worked at these various places as super chef and some other little soda fountain type places, very similar to what kind of places that she worked in before she was ever arrested. Richard Slater, by the way, died in Kentucky in 1968. According to a family story, he died in the arms of another woman. I don't know if that was Eleanor or someone else. So I will just leave it at that. One of the places that Eleanor did work was called Pete's Kitchen, and this is still there. This showed up in a lot of these city directories. Other things that I did find through my research on Marie Millman, though, was she was in the Social Security Death Index, but no SS5 application. For those of you doing Social Security research, you know that at SS5 you can send off to the Social Security Administration and find out what was in the original application, what the applicant put down for parents and birthplace and birth date. And I would have loved to have seen that for Marie Millman, but I do know from working on another case that was very easy to just write anything down, or you could have even had someone write up a delayed birth certificate, just attesting to the fact that you were born on a certain date in a certain place. I still have this private tree for Marie up. There were no hints. I've had it up for 3 years now. I've never had a hint on it from Ancestry. I've never found any paper trail for this woman prior to 1951. And believe me, I read a lot of obituaries and searched a lot of genealogical sites. But the big clincher for me was I sent off to the Denver probate office for the probate file for Marie H. Millman. And after a year and a half of searching, the administrator for her probate showed no heirs and absolutely no family at all. And she only left an estate of about $4,000, but it went to the state of Colorado because nobody could find anything on this woman back in 1980. Here's Pete's Kitchen today. I went in there. I think I'll go back and have a meal sometime, but there's no records there. The previous owners have died. But the probate records did reveal her burial place. It's in Fairmount Cemetery in Denver. She's one of these very flat stones there. You can see behind what's called section 67. I had to go and kind of sweep off a lot of these stones to get the grass clippings off, but I did find Marie H. Millman, 1908 to 1980. So I just sort of sat down next to her and had my lunch and chatted with her a little bit. And I'm kind of I like cemeteries. So I'm used to doing things like that. This was a quote that I just think is great. It was written by a man, actually, a reporter who accompanied her on the train from jail in Chicago to the prison. And he wrote, "When I'm in some wayside diner late at night and a beat up old doll in her 60s is dishing out chili, I'm tempted to ask if she's Eleanor, but I never do. I keep hoping that she got some good out of life. Good night, Eleanor Jarman, wherever you are." So we'll open this up to questions, but I just wanted to mention quickly that I do have this handout, so that's available to all of you. I won't go through it all because you'll get it, but I just want to mention a couple of things. Follow your passion, be open to surprises, bring in other researchers, hire somebody in another city if you need to, and just really dig into those primary sources. So I'll go back to this and let Kate open it up for questions. I hope I didn't overgo my time here.
Thank you very much. So we do have some questions for you. So
Okay.
the first one is, do you think that Richard Slater kept in touch with Eleanor during the reformatory years by mail? And did the reformatory have documentation on mail or packages that were sent to prisoners?
From what I have read from the prison files, she did not get any mail from anyone other than her sister. So no, I do not think that he kept in touch with her. I'm just trying to start my video, but it's not going on. Sorry. I don't think he did directly, no, but I think he may have indirectly through the sister who was caring for Eleanor's children. All of the mail was read by two people at the prison, so they couldn't really say much, but maybe they had a little code or some way of communicating. I would like to think so.
And speaking of Eleanor's sister and her children, have you found that that those relatives have been DNA tested or anything like that?
Not that I know of, and
Okay.
that's a good point to bring in. The only way we could prove, completely prove that Marie Millman is Eleanor Jarman would be for an exhumation and a DNA comparison.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a judge granting a warrant to do that, but that would be the only way to actually prove it.
We have a couple of questions asking about what happened to Eleanor's children and where did they go and where did they end up?
Well, you have to read the book. One son went to Florida for much of his life. The other son stayed in Sioux City, Iowa for much of his life. And they had children and they have children, and I've been in touch with some of them. So they're out there.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And I just wanted to mention that if anybody has additional questions that pop up after the program today, you're also welcome to email us at genealogy@acpl.info, and I'll stick that in the chat. And if you'd like also if you'd like a copy of the chat for today's webinar, please send us an email and we'll send that to you as well. So
okay, and people can contact me directly. I hope that they do. And if anybody wants to take up the challenge, I'm serious. I'll send the Marie Millman private tree. If you contact me and tell me who you are and what your interest is, I'll be glad to forward that on, because I mean, this never ends. You just have to keep going. So thank you.
thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.